Now today we are on to day 4, which is the early republic. So we talked about the 13 colonies. We talked about the American Revolution, where the colonists gained independence from Britain. We talked about the Articles of Confederation, which was our first attempt at a government which failed because it sucked and couldn't enforce any laws. And we talked about the writing and kind of debate around the Constitution. So now we're going to talk about our first 5 presidents, from George Washington through James Monroe. We're also going to talk about this guy. Now this guy, his name is John Marshall. He's a Supreme Court Justice who was an important figure. He's not a president, but we're going to go over him too. Okay, so go ahead and turn to the day 4 page in your long-term packet and get ready to take some notes. So, first of all, George Washington. George Washington is our first president, and that gives him some special powers. He has the power to set precedents. So these are examples and traditions. For instance, he sets the precedent of having a presidential cabinet. Now, I don't mean like a cabinet you have in your kitchen. I mean a cabinet as in a group of expert advisors there to give you advice as the president. You don't need to memorize everyone from Washington's cabinet, but you do need to know 2 main people. You need to know Alexander Hamilton, who was the the Secretary of Treasury, so he's in charge of the money. And you need to know Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State, so he was in charge of foreign affairs. To show me you're listening, go ahead and highlight the terms Jefferson and Hamilton. Now, another thing Washington has to deal with is the Whiskey Rebellion. So let's think about it this way. Say there's this guy named One-Tooth Willie, okay? He's just a small farmer guy, really simple guy, got 1 tooth, not living large. Really he works hard all day, and all he wants at the end of the day is to spend some time with his wife, who may or may not be his cousin, and have his $2 glass of whiskey. Now, say that the federal government puts some new laws in place, and that turns Willie's $2 glass into $5. Now remember, Willie's only happiness in life comes from his cousin/wife and his glass of whiskey at the end of the day. He doesn't make much. What is he going to think? What is he going to do about this problem? Well, you probably guessed, right? He's going to get violent, because at the end of the day, Willie wants his whiskey, okay? Now, he wasn't the one who felt this way. A lot of farmers rebelled after they heard about these taxes on whiskey. Now, when Washington heard about this event, he personally got on his horse to go shut it down. And by the time he got there, word had spread and people had been so intimidated and afraid of him that they all left. Now, this event is important because it proves that Washington and the federal government are strong enough to handle things. Now, additionally, Washington set a precedent. He retires after 2 terms. So after 8 years in office, he says, you know what? I'm going to stop being president, because if I stop now, the country will realize and know how to move on from year to year, because I don't want to be a king. So Washington writes a farewell address. It's basically his goodbye letter to the country. He gives us some advice. He says we should have a policy of neutrality. So think of neutron, in science, like neutron means neutral. So again, not plus, not minus. So policy of neutrality is like stay out of everyone's business. He doesn't want to end up in war. Additionally, he says no sectionalism. Do not put your region above your country. Additionally, he says don't form political parties. Now, do we listen to Washington? No, we do all of those things. So go ahead and highlight the term the federal government are strong enough. Now what I want you to do is pause me, and here's what you're going to do. On the right-hand side, there is a blank box. I want you to pick one of the key points we just talked about and draw a symbol for George Washington right here. Doesn't have to be fancy. All right, so after Washington steps down from power, John Adams is elected as president. Now, some major things that happened while he was in power are something called impressment. So what British and French military started doing is they started actually kidnapping U.S. sailors and forcing them to become part of the French and British military. That's kind of weird, right? It's called impressment. Now, another thing that happened during John Adams' presidency, he passed these laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. So what he was trying to do is he was trying to make it hard for people to become citizens, and he was also trying to silence his political opponents. So he told people that if you speak out against my government, I will throw you in jail. Well, that's a major violation of an amendment, right? Which amendment is that? The first, right? But it took people a while to realize that. Go ahead and highlight this word alien and highlight the word citizen. Now, go ahead, just like you did for George Washington, pause me and draw a symbol to represent one of these key points for John Adams. Now, around this time is when a man named John Marshall gets appointed onto the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the country. Now, John Marshall, the reason why we're talking about him is because he does something very important. Let's talk about it. So first of all, he becomes the Chief Justice. So he's not only part of the court, he's the head judge on the court. Now, Marshall rules in a case called Marbury v. Madison. Say Marbury v. Madison for me. Now, this case is important because it does something called establishing judicial review. This term, judicial review, means that the court has the right to get rid of bad laws. So if the president or Congress does something that's bad, the court can stop them. Before that, they didn't have this power. So John Marshall, this guy right here, he's credited with increasing the power of the judicial branch. He makes it stronger. Remember in class we did that, we looked at kind of these weak refs with the football players. So he strengthens the refs up so that they can actually have a say in the game. So just like we've been doing, use one of these key points to draw a symbol to represent John Marshall. So after John Adams, a man named Thomas Jefferson becomes president. Now, a big deal about this transition from Adams to Jefferson is that there are two different political parties. Now, it's a peaceful transition of power, though. So just like when President Trump was elected, President Obama, they're very different people with very different viewpoints. There was a peaceful transition of power, right? President Obama stepped down and Trump became president. Now, that's a tradition that goes back to Jefferson and Adams, that standard of passing things on peacefully, even though you may not agree with that person. So while Jefferson is president, that same issue of impressment where the British are kidnapping American sailors, that's still going on, still. So Jefferson says, okay, I'm going to try and deal with this. I have a plan. I'm going to punish Britain and France by banning all trade with them. So I'm going to pass an embargo. An embargo is a ban on trade. Now, this turns out to be an epic fail because Britain and France just go, okay, we'll go trade with someone else. Meanwhile, in America, all those people who relied on that trade for their jobs, they all lose their jobs because they have no one buying their stuff anymore. So, epic fail, Jefferson, epic fail. Now, lastly, a major thing that happens while Jefferson is president is the Louisiana Purchase. So this is that territory right here in the middle. It doubles the size of the U.S., guys. And it starts westward expansion. And it was super cheap for back then. Comes down to a few cents an acre. That's nuts. And that's going to start a whole trend of moving west and trying to go from sea to shining sea. Go ahead and highlight this term Embargo Act for me, as well as Louisiana Purchase. Okay, now, go ahead, just like you've been doing, draw a symbol about a key point. So after Jefferson, we have James Madison. So some things to remember from James Madison is that he stops the issue of impressment. So it's still going on, and he says, okay, enough is enough, we're going to war over this. So he declares war with Britain, and this is the War of 1812. Now, during this war, the British set up a blockade. So they'd line up their ships all along the coast right here so that America can't trade or get their goods from other countries. Now, this creates a problem because now America has to manufacture and make everything they usually buy. But that leads to the development of factories and industry. Additionally, America wins the War of 1812, And that's partially because of Andrew Jackson, what a Jackson, right, at the Battle of New Orleans. Go ahead and highlight this term War of 1812 and Battle of New Orleans. Oh, and the War of 1812 is also where the British tried to succeed at burning down the White House. Go ahead and draw a symbol for James Madison. Alright, and lastly we have James Monroe. What a lucky guy. So after the War of 1812 ends and America wins, James Monroe becomes president, and everyone's feeling really good because they just beat Britain, this huge superpower, for the second time. And he gets all the credit. This leads to an era in our time period called the era of good feelings, where people are feeling good, and manufacturing or making things with factories is booming. Now, something that Monroe does is he gets a little more powerful. He writes the Monroe Doctrine. So basically he says, hey, Europe, stay on your hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere is no longer open for business or your colonization. You stay out of the way, and we won't bother you. If you choose to get in our way, we'll stop you. So America's getting a little bold, right? And as always, now draw a symbol about one of these key points. Whew, that was a lot of information, right? Let's practice. Get out your Day 4 handout and your class copy of the President's Desk. So for this activity, you're going to look at different presidents' desks and what they have on them. And with that information and your background knowledge, you're going to answer questions on your handout. Alright, so for George Washington's desk, there's a couple letters. So there's a letter from a guy named A. Ham talking about America's credit, you need to start a bank. There's a letter from Mr. Jefferson talking about a man named Hamilton. And there's a New York Times article saying President puts down farmer uprising in western Pennsylvania. Okay, let's give you some question hints. So for number 2, the U.S. debt. So that's how much money the country owes. It's a lot, right? What major war did they just fight? Remember, Washington's the first president. So what war did he lead? Another note is that these little numbers and letters at the end, these correspond to packets. So you can either get your hard copy out or you can look them up on Google Classroom for help. So go ahead and pause me and answer the questions that go with George Washington's desk. You can listen to music as long as it's not a distraction, or you can work very quietly with the people at your table. Alright, here's John Adams' desk. You see that there's a sign that says Vote Federalist Party, a Wall Street Journal about an anti-immigrant thing, and an act from Congress. Go ahead and answer questions 1 through 4. Pause me. Alright, now we have Thomas Jefferson. He is Democratic Republican. I see this random chunk of land in the middle of the country. I see a letter from Lewis and Clark. And I see a letter from a mom who's concerned about her son who was a sailor. Think back to what Britain was doing to American sailors. Go ahead and answer questions 1 through 6 for Thomas Jefferson. Chief Justice John Marshall's desk. We see a Washington Post article about a major Supreme Court decision on judicial review. We see a letter from a chief of Cherokee Nation of Indians, that's interesting, and a letter from President Jefferson. Go ahead and look at these things and answer the corresponding questions. And President Madison. Take a look at these images and messages and answer the appropriate questions. Okay, go ahead and do your exit ticket, which is on the back of your Day 4 handout, and do your Day 4 reflection. And if you are finished early, go ahead and grab an envelope and get started on your puzzle.